Hello and welcome to the President's Podcast right here on the record with the Ohio Senate. The views the news excludes. I'm your host, John Fortney, the Director of Communication with the Senate Republican Caucus, the Majority Caucus in the Ohio Senate. Back on the President's Podcast this week, Ohio Senate President Matt Huffman and former Senate President Keith Faber, who is now the current State Auditor of Ohio, or as I like to call them, two guys from Lima. Great to have you both on.
The people from Salina might argue with you about
well,
that.
Salina, Lima. That's right. Yes. See, the years passed.
We're the first-ring suburbs of Lima. So
there you go.
We've spent a lot.
Bedroom community.
We've spent a lot of time in Lima, or at least I have. The state audit, cost of concurrent enrollment. $1 billion over 4 years. And when we talk about the cost of concurrent enrollment, it was an audit by Keith Faber into the Department of Medicaid that showed that people are not only enrolled in Ohio Medicaid, but some of them were double dipping in other states. And there is a significant cost to taxpayers with this.
Yeah, essentially, there were some that were enrolled in as many as 8 states. And what was happening is the Department of Medicaid is not doing its cross-checks to figure out whether people are enrolled in other states. And while the beneficiaries are probably not getting their health bills paid by Indiana and Ohio or Ohio and Colorado, our Medicaid managed care organizations essentially get paid by the state on a per member per month fee. So having another 124,000 people enrolled where they're not likely to have to pay for medical procedures is a windfall for them. And our estimates were that it's close to $1 billion over 4 years.
And when you think about it, too, President Huffman, that's $1 billion that could have been going to families that really needed the help.
Well, yeah, we obviously there are a lot of other costs that we have, and we have significant taxes in the state of Ohio, one of the higher taxed Republican held states in the union. But I think people should compare this to the private insurance market. How many people have said, well, we're not going to cover you on our company policy because your spouse is covered on another policy? And of course, your spouse's company may be telling you the same thing. So we have this argument among companies, sometimes governments, to say, well, we're not covering you if you're already covered someplace else. If we're not doing that on the state, we have these kind of calamities. And, again, we have to thank the state auditor, Keith Faber, and his staff for doing this. This will be a great blueprint for trying to solve some of these cost issues.
This was a follow-up on a federal audit that happened in 2018, 2019, which essentially found the same thing. And so we asked the simple question, okay, what have you done about it? And the answer is not much. And this is a follow-up. This is the third Medicaid audit we've done since I've been auditor that have found similar things in their mismanagement. We found a situation where they were paying ineligible beneficiaries hundreds of millions of dollars for people that were in jails and people that were other places. We also found another audit that said that they were not checking the alerts that their own system generates, and so counties were not checking those to disenroll people during the time when they could disenroll people. And so really what we have is a multi-billion-dollar payment system which has some management problems. And until those management problems get in control, we're going to have a tough time justifying the billions of dollars that Medicaid spends.
And I would say this too, John. This is, as we said, yeoman's work on the Medicaid system. We have this problem across the spectrum with other payments that we make. And I've mentioned here a number of times Joe Patton in Allen County, where we have this really active member or director of the Department of Job and Family Services, where they make house calls on people and they say, hey, you're getting a check for this particular program, and we want to make sure things are going okay. And the people there at the door say, he doesn't live here. He lives in Michigan. He comes here once a month to pick up his check. And those folks, and if you know how to work the system and apply in several states and get checks, well, this money is supposed to be going to people who really need it. It's not a money-making operation. So, some of this can be solved at the local level, but you have to have departments that are going to be active in rooting out the fraud and the double dipping. or triple dipping.
And does it start at the county level? Does it start with retraining the bureaucracy of of not just the staff at the county level, but also at the state level?
President Huffman's so correct on this, is that effectively Ohio runs a statewide Medicaid system administered by 88 separate counties. And so the counties that have an interest of trying to drive efficiency, drive checks to make sure the right people are getting the right benefits, effectively trying to get people off of public assistance, not on public assistance, is an important differentiation as to the people who are doing the job well. And so look, the bottom line is as Republicans, as conservatives, we want people who need help and are entitled to help to get help. But we also want to make sure we have a pathway to self-sufficiency. And that's the differentiation that some of the good JFS directors are doing. Back when I was in the Senate, we tried some ideas to try and put some incentives in place for workers and job and family services organizations to find ways to help people become independent, help them become self-sufficiently. There was a lot of pushback on that, but Matt and his colleagues have been successful in trying to get that conversation started again. Long term, a hand up is far better than a hand out.
Yeah, and I would just add, we need to have, as we say, the social safety net for the people who are there. But we talk a lot about our freedoms in the United States, about right to free speech and jury trial and freedom of the press and all that. But you're not really free until you are financially free. You're in charge of your own money. You decide where to spend it. You're not dependent on the government or somebody else. That's why, kids appreciate what their parents do, or at least sometimes they do. But when they're on their own with their own money, that's when they're free. They can buy their car. They can do whatever they want. So some of these folks are just fraudsters. Some of these folks are, the easier path is just to accept benefits. And there are a lot of people in that position who would like to get a job and not have to worry about, when is my check coming, be able to buy their own house. And so when we enable people to become financially free, that is really on the path to true freedom.
You both are longtime members of the General Assembly, have served in leadership positions, obviously. How does this affect budgeting every 2 years? The legislature comes up with the final version of the budget. How does this level of fraud affect what the taxpayers are funding budget-wise?
Well, I think, so I've been in the Senate for 8 years. I was in the House. One of the things that everyone should keep in mind, I think, is budgets are opinions. They're estimations of what is going to happen over the 2 years. And of course, the opinions are informed because we've seen what's happened in the past and in the future. What we don't want is for a program that we enable to run out of money, to not have cash to pay. And this particular Medicaid program is an extraordinary cost to the state. One of the biggest budget line items. And if we put money over there and once it's gone, it's gone. The approximately $600 million that we lost essentially to fraud during the pandemic for a variety of reasons. So this is a giant program that if, in fact, we can get it under control, we can stop the things that the Auditor Faber and his team have been able to expose, it's really going to help us on a lot of other line items.
Medicaid is one of the largest programs in state government. It wasn't that many years ago, when I first got into the legislature, that Medicaid was a relatively small percentage of the state budget. It has become the Pac-Man that has been consuming much of the rest of the ability for state government to do things that it needs to do. And remember, every dollar that state government takes from taxpayers is a dollar less that those taxpayers have to spend on their priorities and things where they're thinking are important. And so, look, Medicaid is competing with K-12 education, it's competing with higher education, it's competing with public safety, it's competing with all of those other things state government does or needs to do. And so every dollar you can pull out of the system by eliminating fraud, waste, and abuse is a dollar that the state has the ability to do other things with, or, like many of us want to do, allow consumers and taxpayers to keep that money in their own wallet.
Yeah, we believe it's your money first as fiscal conservatives, not the government's money first. Before I leave the audit, a lot of things are done online now, and I believe that you can actually register online. Is this sort of the 89th county, and how do you address that? I mean, your office can make recommendations, and then how do you keep pushing to make sure those get implemented?
Well, this is where the interesting thing of having an independent state auditor's office comes in. To keep our independence, we make recommendations, and then we can follow up to see whether the recommendations are implemented. But ultimately, it's on the General Assembly and the administration to do the right thing and to do the things they need to be efficient. And so we made a series of recommendations in the audit. I have high confidence in the legislature to try and pressure the administration to do some of those things. But honestly, the administration pushed back on some of the things in the audit findings. And we disagree with some of their pushback. One of their things that they brought up was, well, look, this was during the pandemic, and your audit period included the pandemic, and the feds limited what we could do. No, one of the things the feds pretty clearly said is that one of the reasons you could still remove people from Medicaid during the pandemic was if they're registered in another state. And so that was not the reason you chose not to remove people. But ultimately, the administration has to have an incentive, has to have a willingness to implement recommendations.
And let me comment, people go to the ballot sometimes and they vote obviously for governor, and that's important. And they may know their local legislative races, and then they think about these statewide races, and we're going to have an auditor and a treasurer and secretary of state. Maybe some people aren't sure what necessarily they do, but this is the significance of having a separately elected statewide official. The auditor doesn't work for the governor. He doesn't work for the legislature. He can go in and tell each of those bodies whatever bad news or good news he wants to tell them based on facts, based on investigation, not based on I need to make sure that these people stay employed or whatever it is. But the auditor, Keith's right, that ultimately the legislature needs to make those decisions. Of course, the governor can weigh in with signature or veto. But I have to hasten to add here that, legislators are not experts in I may be an expert in practicing law in Western Ohio, that's one thing, but we have dozens, and if I break it down, perhaps hundreds of topics that we essentially have to make judgments on. So we all know that we don't want double dipping. We don't want fraud. We don't want these things to happen. The auditor and his staff need to say, here's how you can prevent that, and then we have to act on it.
Are you a resident of the state of Ohio? Have you ever been enrolled in another state?
That's a pretty easy
Little
one.
things like that.
That's a
right?
pretty easy one, yeah.
Basic questions.
Yeah. Let's move on to something that's not so basic. We have talked about it a lot here on the podcast, and that is the impending, looming ballot initiative by Citizens Not Politicians. We held this little flowchart up, which is not little, right around 60 different steps that you have to take just to put together the new so-called Citizens Commission. This was a product of Ohio Politics Guru on Twitter. Guru, thank you for this. This is very interesting. Don't know who Guru is, but this is how it would work or potentially not work. As state auditor, you sit on the Redistricting Commission, part of the process that was passed by voters overwhelmingly, more than 70% of the vote back in 2015 and also 2018. What's your thoughts on this repeated attempt to try to reform what was already reformed by the voters?
Look, it's a horrible idea. I'll start out with that. When you try and take politics out of an inherently political process, you end up with worse problems. And this organization is not apolitical. It has a very clear political leftist bent. They're all funded by the same funders. They all have the same support. And because they're not putting elected officials on there, doesn't mean they're not putting political people on there. I ask a rhetorical question. Who wants to serve on a redistricting commission if you have no interest in politics or no interest in political outcomes? Good luck finding people who have that model. They're not going to go out and just draft people from the citizenry. So the people who are going to apply for those positions all have their own political leanings. And their rules have cut out most anybody who would have a knowledge of what the impacts and other impacts are outside of the political organizations that are going to be feeding people in the organization, like the League of Women Voters. And so that's part of the problem. But the bigger problem is how is this going to work and what is the outcome? This is a very narrowly tailored process to lead to progressive political outcomes. If you look at the states where something like this has been done, almost always the final outcome is more progressive elected officials and fewer conservatives. It is a political outcome that is designed to hurt Ohio.
And Michigan found that out on their own a few months ago by violating the Federal Voting Rights Act.
Yeah, one of the ways that this is designed, and again, Keith hit it on the head, that progressive left-leaning folks can get their people into office. One of those ways is to take a portion of an inner city urban district and sort of pinwheel it out into the suburbs, and the folks in the suburbs get elected. And inevitably, what that leads to is African American legislators losing their seats. And, you know, all political parties are made up of various factions. And by and large, most African American legislators are socially conservative. We may not call them conservatives in terms of other things that they vote on, but that's where their position is. The folks doing this are not interested in their views. What they're interested in is their progressive leftist power that they will have. And so folks may say, well, that's just Huffman. He's been involved in this for a long time. This just happened in Michigan. Same plan, same map. The African American legislators sued, saying this violated the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and they won. The federal court said, yes, you did. You'll be hearing from those people during this campaign and other folks. So this is never about fair maps. This is never about gerrymandering, except that we would like to gerrymander these maps so that we get what we want. It's really odd that the League of Women Voters is one of the groups pushing this, because they were one of the groups pushing the 2015 and 18 reforms, which we all endorsed and passed overwhelmingly. So it must be a new set of people in charge of the League of Women Voters. But, you know, the other interesting thing, the fascinating thing is, of course, the Supreme Court sort of blew this up, didn't allow it to go forward in 21 and 22. Once the Supreme Court did not interject in 23, this passed by a unanimous bipartisan vote on obviously a very hot political topic last year. Now, tell me anywhere in the United States where that has happened on such a topic, and it hasn't. So
the president's right. Under the rules, if not implemented or interfered with by a clearly activist former Supreme Court, you would have had agreement and you would have had a deal. When we came at it, unfortunately, they were crazy enough to pick me as the chairman. We got a 7-0 vote, and we got a 7-0 vote because everybody understood the risk, like the current constitutional provisions require. Everybody has to manage risk. But if you recall, during the first version of the redistricting attempts, you know, the ones that went back and forth to the court, it was very clear that the Supreme Court at the time, the majority of the court, led by the lady who's pushing this, clearly said, until the Democrats sign off on it, we're not going to give anybody what they want, and we're going to continue to keep this active in the courts. That was clearly the impression everybody
And that's not
had.
what the law says.
It is not. There is a very clear provision that, you know, look, they had the right to interpret it. They did. I think they got it wrong. I have the right to say I think they got it wrong. Having said all of that, it was amazing. Once the allied liberal groups and their friends thought that they weren't guaranteed an outcome from the Supreme Court to challenge until the cows come home, we had compromise. And that's what the process was originally envisioned to do, is to give everybody a right to have risk. And when you negotiate with risk involved, you tend to get a compromise. When people view the risk of saying yes outweighed by the benefits of saying no, you almost always get people saying no for political reasons or for whatever the thing is. And we had that directly. I was told by Democrats on the Redistricting Commission, and I said this in my deposition, we won't agree to a negotiated outcome as long as X or Y. And that is the circumstance that leads to them wanting a court challenge. They thought they would do better in the courts no matter what the deal was.
It's amazing when the NDRC, the Fair Districts groups, or as I like to call them, the Unfair Districts groups, and the League of Liberal Misinformation were removed from the process and let the commission actually do the work 7-0 vote that produced the most compact maps in really the history of Ohio.
Yeah, not only the maps were more compact, it's easier to govern. Those were the things that we put in the 2015 reform, which dealt with the General Assembly. We're not dividing up communities. We don't have elongated districts. And really most of state government is administered at the county or local level. And that's why it's easier to know who your state rep or state senator is. That was part of the importance of the 2015 reform. The 2018 reform was the congressional reform. And of course, the map we passed pursuant to that constitutional process, that ultimately was appealed to the Supreme Court by these leftist groups. Now, once the court decided the North Carolina case and said, no, the states can do that, they can take politics in, that case was remanded back to the Ohio Supreme Court in 23 to say, read what we said in North Carolina. You redecide what we said under the previous Supreme Court.
In other words, you got it wrong.
You got it wrong, and so look at this and make a decision. Well, what did the leftist groups do? They dismissed the case. And the reason they gave for that is, well, we think there's been enough litigation. That's ridiculous. They dismissed the case on the congressional redistricting because they were going to lose. And so the answer is, if we want voters and their elected officials to make decisions versus judges, which is to make these political and policy decisions, then we have to let them do it. Otherwise, somebody in a robe someplace is going to make all your decisions for you.
And I thought it was very interesting, too, that regarding the maps for the General Assembly, the federal court, I believe was on page 78, and it's fairly easy to find, talked about the 4-3 majority at the time basing its ruling on standards, quote, not easily found anywhere in the Constitution. Translated, it's not found in the Constitution anywhere.
Look, when we pushed and the voters approved, and both President Huffman and myself were involved in drafting these provisions, when we did those things, our fundamental, overarching, bipartisan, fundamental basis for putting that in the Constitution and our overarching guidelines were really this. We wanted compact districts that allowed people to be represented by people who they knew and trusted. If you go to hub and spoke districts like President Huffman mentioned, which is what this proposal calls for, so that you can get a desired political outcome, that's called gerrymandering. And ultimately, the proposal that's in law now limits your ability to do that. It requires you to keep communities together, to draw compact districts, and that's going to allow people to be represented by people who share their interests and values. That's the current system. The new system will give you some kind of a political outcome to balance, and it's going to have people represented by people who have no idea how they can share their beliefs and values, because candidly, you're going for a political outcome. You're not going for community representation and keeping things compact.
Right, and the short version of that is have the court draw the map. Recently, the head of the League of Women Voters in Ohio was on the Then What Happened podcast from the Columbus Dispatch. It was an interesting conversation. Jen Miller said the following, quote, "But at the end of the day, there was no ability, no explicit ability for the Supreme Court to draw their own maps or get their own special mapping masters. We have that now." And she's referring to this flow chart. Basically, having the court draw the maps through the whole process and then rule on said map. Why would the General Assembly, a separate branch of government, ever want the judicial branch to legislate what the political districts would be for the General Assembly? Isn't that judicial activism? Why would the judiciary be involved in legislating maps for the GA?
And when that person says there's no explicit authority to them to do that, there is an explicit ban on the Supreme Court doing that. Constitutional reforms that were put in 2015 said the Supreme Court shall not draw any map or district. And that was specifically part of the reform. And of course, lots of states, those kinds of things were happening. They'd go up to the U.S. Supreme Court. We wanted to make that clear. And one of the reasons that was important is what Keith just mentioned. The people at the table had a series of incentives and penalties, both the majority and minority under the current system. And essentially, we had folks sitting around the table saying, well, in the past, 2010 and 2010 and 2000, Republicans could just say, here's the map, we followed civil rights, federal law, we're going to do what we want. In 1990 and 1980 and 1970, that was the Democrats doing the same thing. The new program said, look, it's probably better for us to give the minority somewhat what they want. And the minority party, who always voted no, well, if we do some of the things the majority, we can vote yes. It was the compromise, it was the working together that everybody says they want, but ultimately when it happens, folks like this are saying, give me more of what I want and less of a compromised, let's all talk about it together situation.
This concept of representational fairness is a nebulous concept. It's always a shifting goal, and it's what you want under the terms to meet your own political agenda, and that's why it doesn't work. And if you go back to the fundamental truism that in Ohio, people want to be represented by people who share their values and share their beliefs. And in Ohio, for the most part, people tend to live around people who think and vote like them. And if you want to divide that up to hit some political statewide proportionality, you're, by the very, very nature of that, going to have an awful lot of people in Ohio represented by somebody who doesn't share their thoughts and beliefs. And that's the outcome of this proposal.
And as I think the president said in an earlier podcast, the legislature doesn't tell the judicial branch how to rule on cases.
Well, yeah, I had some folks say, well, hey, when the Supreme Court ordered the Redistricting Commission, and by the way, we tried several times and did meet what they did, even though we're not required to do that, but ultimately would not pass a map, which apparently they needed to have. Well, that's a little bit like the legislature passing a law that says, Supreme Court, you shall issue this opinion. Well, we can't do that, and nor can the Supreme Court order us to pass a law. So, we went through this. It was really a terrible process, and frankly, for everybody involved in 21 and 22. We did our best to do what the Supreme Court said, and twice redrew our map and complied with their opinion. Then their map maker looked at it and said, we're still not going to elect enough leftist Democrats. Give them another order. Well, ultimately, again, once we got past all of that, everybody sat down at the table. Not everybody got what they want, including some not real happy Republicans in some of the bigger counties. But we ultimately got a map and unanimous bipartisan vote.
It's interesting to me that the only place you see the progressives and the leftists doing this kind of proposal are in red states. You don't see this in New York. You don't see this in New Jersey. You don't see this in other places.
California.
That ought to tell you more about what you are seeking, and what they're seeking is an outcome. They want an outcome. They really don't care how the process is to get them to that outcome, despite what they're going to say.
Yeah, in Maryland, for example, which is about a 60-40 Democrat-Republican state, they recently had a Republican governor, Larry Hogan. 7 out of their 8 congressional representatives are Democrats, which is 87% or so. The Republican Party in Maryland contacted Eric Holder and said, we think we have some gerrymandering here. Can your group come in and sue for us? And apparently their calls weren't returned. So this is about political power. It's about going to the places where they think that they can win, because Ohio is a 50% plus 1 constitutional state. It's a big state with a lot of congressional seats. That's where they want to come in and spend their money.
If you have money, put yourself on the ballot. Speaking of the November ballot, been a lot of questions about, will Joe Biden make the ballot? You've been on the record talking to the media a lot about where things stand. What's the update on that, if any?
Well, the concept of 90 days before the election, that's been part of election law for a long time. If you have an initiative, if the legislature has to do something, we have to pass a resolution at least 90 days beforehand. So we've known about that for a long time. Apparently the National Democratic Party or the local ones weren't aware of that until Frank LaRose did his job and said, hey, you all need to be aware of this. When he called and told me about it, I said, by the way, no one on the Democrat side is going to say, hey, thanks for letting us know. They're going to say, you're trying to keep Biden off the ballot. So we got a little bit of a chuckle out of that. That's exactly what happened. But, as I've said, states can't affect significantly in the moment federal elections. Members of Congress, we once had a term limits proposal put in our Constitution for congressional representatives. U.S. Supreme Court said can't do that, states. That's a federal issue. Colorado Supreme Court tried to keep Donald Trump off the ballot. Supreme Court said can't do that. No, that's not your call. So this is ultimately going to result in Joe Biden being on the ballot. It's just the mechanism of how that gets done. And that's either going to get passed in a bill perhaps next week or soon thereafter. But despite this being sort of a hot, interesting, juicy topic, the legislature is working on other things right now besides something that's ultimately we know how it's going to get resolved.
Sure. Also, before we let both of you guys get on with your day in the business of the people of Ohio, another stay was issued on House Bill 68 by the Franklin County judge, extending it out, I think, another 30 days, well into May. What's your thoughts about that? Because clearly House Bill 68 had the best interest of minors, children, protecting them from these radical, life-altering, permanent surgeries, and also keeping men out of women's sports, boys out of girls' locker rooms. What's your thoughts about having a single county judge sort of bench shopping, so to speak, because a big city doesn't like a policy that the legislature passed? Same thing when it comes to the tobacco law that we said, no, cities can't have a ban on menthol cigarettes or on vape products.
Yeah, and you can add the heartbeat bill to the list, which sort of sat dormant for a year during the campaign on issue 1 in November. There is a fundamental problem with a single judge issuing a statewide ban on a constitutionally enacted law. We have kind of the same problem, frankly, in the federal courts. It's often the 9th District in California, which is issuing a temporary restraining order or some sort of injunction. Those things are, I think, a significant problem. I think that needs to be addressed in some significant way, because if a judge will sort of just continue to do this, it's really affecting. This is supposed to be a republic. You elect folks, they come in, you follow the Constitution, the governor can veto or not. And I think on topics like this, which are very fundamental, understood issues, where there's really a very small portion of people, we shouldn't necessarily govern by polls, but if you ask people, should we allow gender reassignment surgery, which I think those words together are kind of nonsense 1984, the book 1984 words, men and women's sports, men and women's bathrooms, large portion of the public say, of course we can't do that. Maybe there's some other accommodations for people, all of those kinds of things. But judges can't shut that down. And so we have to address what's going on here.
Final thought. In the 131st General Assembly, when you were Senate President, you sort of got the ball rolling. You got things started in reducing the overall amount of tax brackets in Ohio. I believe there were 9 back then, and you thought, that's way too many. We can do a better job. And today we have 2. What's the sense of accomplishment when you see where we are today?
It's a good start. Look, I've for a long time said I'm a fan of eliminating the personal income tax in Ohio. I think the legislature's on that path. It makes us think about more efficiency. It makes us think about keeping things where they're at. Ultimately, the other issue right now, the big issue in our communities, is the property tax burden that has gone up dramatically. And that's directly tied to K-12 education and the amount of spending. Stay tuned. We may be working on something in that area in the auditor's office. But eventually you have to figure out how to both make sure the property tax is affordable for taxpayers and make Ohio a competitive place to do business and grow the economy. The legislature has been working hard on that, and I think that they've made good progress.
Yeah, Ohio is a great place for small businesses. If you're small, your business income is under $300,000, you're not paying any income tax. our changes last year to the budget eliminated the commercial activity tax for 90% of the businesses in the state of Ohio. So if you're thinking, well, I'm going to try to start up this shop or whatever it may be, it's better to be in Lima, Ohio than Fort Wayne, Indiana. It's better to be in Toledo than Monroe. It's better to be in Cincinnati than Covington, Kentucky. So it's a great place to be, and these are reforms that have been put in place over the last. I've been here 4 years. We had President Obhoff and President Faber. Really started with President Faber, now Auditor Faber under Governor Kasich. So there is a lot more to go. But Keith's right. Ultimately, these things are also about spending. It's about other tax policies at the local level that eliminate taxes for some people through abatements and other incentives, which necessarily raise the folks who are already there. We want new people to come in, but when they're not paying taxes, but we have to increase services because of the people who have their abatements to get them here, everybody else's taxes go up. So that needs to be addressed in a systematic way also.
And last thought, current events, we saw all the protests at these universities across the country, Columbia University, the encampments, the blockades, didn't seem to happen so much at Ohio State. What's your thoughts on free speech and time, place, and manner? That's been in place a long time.
We're big free speech advocates. The problem is you have to also recognize everybody else's rights at the time you're exercising free speech. Free speech does not include the right to do an encampment, does not include the right to exclude other people from using resources that they're engaged in, or interrupt somebody's ability to take final exams. I want to give a shout out to the Ohio State University president. I know he's got some flack from the left. I think he did exactly the right thing to make sure that order and policies are enforced uniformly and without regard to bias or without regard to content of the speech. They were very clear. They gave people warnings. They said, you guys can stay till this time. At this time, we're gonna clear the oval. You're not going to have a tent encampment because we don't allow camping in the oval. Those kind of policies were uniform. They were neutral. I think President Carter did a great job. And I want to give a shout out to him for his efforts in being consistent and making sure Ohio State is in Columbia.
Yeah, so it's a part of a culture that has developed really since the 60s and 70s, and a lot of those folks are still in either teaching or administrative positions in higher education, that they allow, condone, take your pick, look the other way at terrible things that are happening. And it perhaps would be one thing if these were students who were sort of spontaneously angry about something and decided to do that. But it's not. These are political actors who come on and sort of jumpstart a lot of these things. But let's set all that aside for a second. The reason why taxpayers in the state of Ohio pay for higher education, and that includes people who never would get to go to college for whatever reason, either don't get to or can't or don't want to. The reason why we're taking their dollars and sending it to Ohio State and these other institutions and the grants and things that we do for private is for education. It's not so somebody has a place to go and yell and scream. Now, again, that's fine. We want people to talk about it, laboratories of learning and all that sort of thing. But how angry are you if you're a tool and die worker in, Ford Motor Plant in Lima, Ohio, and you're paying your taxes, and you look on TV and see a bunch of people screaming and, breaking windows and doing things like that? That's not why that guy's paying his taxes. And so universities need to understand that type of behavior is over. Lots of things are over, and that's why we passed Senate Bill 83. We're not going to pay people to not work. We're not going to pay people to teach when they don't have any students. We're not going to give money to universities that allow people to destroy the buildings or disrupt the learning process. That's not why we have universities.
Interesting number from the Ohio State. They're protesting in favor of a terrorist organization, which always just blows my mind. Israel's one of our closest allies anywhere in the world, certainly in the Middle East. But of the arrests that occurred at Ohio State, 46 arrests, only 16 were university-affiliated people. So the other number, the majority of the people that were arrested, were not affiliated with Ohio State University.
Paid protesters, maybe.
Well, it's amazing when you look at the tents that are being erected. Their North Face and their REI tents that, $400 or $500 a piece. I doubt the average poor college student that's eating ramen noodles is buying that tent to go erect it on the Oval. I'm just telling you, it's a different environment. And just to follow up on what the president said, higher education right now is having huge challenges. The world of higher education is changing. And if they reject that change because of culture, because of whatever it is, you're going to see more and more institutions of higher education fail. And ultimately, that's not good for Ohio, but we need to figure out how, one, they can be efficient and how they can be effective to do their job of educating our next generation. But they're not going to get there. They're not going to get there if they keep clinging to the old ways. And that's where I think we're going to see changes in higher education. And it's coming whether they like it or not.
State Auditor Keith Faber, former Senate President, and current Senate President Matt Huffman. Gentlemen, thanks for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thanks, John.
Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.